Hello, welcome back. We are going to start with emotions. If you did not watch my introductory video, please go back and view that video so you kind of know where we're at with emotions and how they come into play. Also, if you did not watch the video on thinking error identification and Mr. Murderman, also please go back and watch that. These videos are, if you haven't learned already, if you've been watching from the beginning, they do kind of go in order. There will come a time where I do videos out of order, but to really build on some of the stuff that when videos kind of start to not go in order, we're going to want to have a foundation. So all of these are going to go in order. So if you get to one and you have not seen the other ones, please go back, or there's a potential that you could be kind of lost. I think you can use the skill sets without going back, but it's not going to be as beneficial. So if you have not watched the first two videos prior to this one, please go back and watch those. As always, I will not respond back to any comments, whether they are positive or negative. I kind of went over that in my first video. I just don't feel the need to banter back and forth with people online. It's not worth my energy. I hope it's not worth yours either. So you're free to leave a comment. However, that's not where I will respond. If at any time you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to email me at utlcsw@gmail.com. That is posted in my YouTube link so you can kind of see what my email is. Again, please feel free to reach out, questions, comments, concerns, anything that you may need. Also, these videos are not intended to replace therapy. I am not a replacement therapist. I am a therapist, but I am not your replacement therapist. These videos are simply just used to take skill sets and build off of them and possibly see if it's something that you feel like could benefit you. If anything comes up for you and you are in therapy, feel free to take this to your therapist and they can help you build off of it. This is not to replace therapy. These are just for education only. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move on to emotions. So this is that second piece of the CBT triangle. Okay, we covered thoughts in our last video. We identified those. We identified the errors. We kind of learned what happens when you have an error. You learned in the previous video that if there's a thinking error, there's an error in the emotion. So there's a possibility we are going through the day telling ourselves how we feel, but that might not necessarily be appropriate or the truest emotion that we could possibly find. Okay, so emotions are feelings that we feel in relation to situations, thoughts, and behaviors. So remember, the CBT triangle, all three pieces go together. You can't have one without the other. So your emotions are things that you feel in relation to those situation, thoughts, and behaviors. Emotions are important to understand as they play a role in the thought process and the behavioral process. They help us with potential threats in the environment, and they help influence our perception. Okay, so you can see on the right hand side of the screen, I have what's called the feelings wheel. Again, just like with the CBT triangle, you can go on Google and type in the feelings wheel. 1,000,001 are going to pop up. Okay, this feelings wheel that I have posted actually is not my favorite one. It's actually just the one that looked the best for the amount of space that I had. However, the Calm app, if you guys have the Calm app, they have a website and their feelings wheel is actually my favorite one. That's the one I used in individual therapy, but find one that works for you. It gets a little tricky because these wheels are they all depict the same thing, but the words are always different. So with the CBT triangle, they're depicted the same and they look the same. The feelings wheels do not. Sometimes if you have a feelings wheel, there will be words on certain feelings wheels that are not on other feelings wheels. Okay, so just find one that works for you. If you have one that you like, great. If it's not working for you so much, go ahead and try and find one that really does work for you. The goal of the feelings wheel is to read from the core out. So you can see in this wheel that I have, in the core, it's happy, strong, anger, fear, sad, and calm. You want to read it from the core out. The reason why I like the calm one is I feel like the way they have the lines set up really helps you be able to branch out very easily. Okay, so you want to start from the core out. The goal of the feelings wheel is to get your brain away from the quote unquote core emotions, right? Because as you can see, if we go to that anger category on the screen, it's orange. If you have another feelings wheel, it might be red. But in anger, you can see if we count, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 12 branch off emotions just in that category of anger. The goal of this is to get yourself and the brain a little bit more used to what you're truly feeling. Because it's one thing to say, I'm angry about this, but it's another thing to go really beyond the surface of how you're really feeling. So when I do this in individual therapy, one of the things I will do with people is we will go through and say someone comes in and they're having a really hard day and anger is the category that they are just drawn to. I will actually go through and write out every single emotion in the anger category that they may be feeling. And then we go through and we type those into like a dictionary online to get the very specific meaning of what that is. And sometimes by the time we're left over, in the beginning, when we wrote 12 emotions, we'll maybe be down to between 5 and 7. Because what I really want people to understand is the brain itself is a very literal organ. So when we can very literally tell it what it's feeling, it goes, I like that. That is how I'm feeling. I can get down with that. So the goal of this essentially is to really just make sure you're using the most appropriate emotion. Again, find one that works for you. They all have different wording. They should not be too confusing. They're all depicted the same, but the words are a little bit different. Okay, so I talked a little bit about appropriate emotions. Now we're going to introduce that emotion anxiety. So I use this by way of Samson the snake. So you can see we have a little Samson the snake on the screen. In my office, I actually have like the stuffed animal snakes that are like 3 feet long. I have a couple of those in my office that I use for this activity. So meet Samson the snake. In therapy, I say hi to Samson. My clients are like, hi, Samson. And they're like, what the hell is about to happen? But here we go. Samson helps us understand the true meaning of the emotion anxiety versus the disorder. Samson helps us understand the harmful effects of telling ourselves that we are anxious. He helps us understand the difference between anxiety and stress. So I do not have a feelings wheel up here because, like I said, they're all different. And I unfortunately cannot use the calm one for this because that they own that image. But that is my favorite one. And on that feelings wheel, in the core, you see the core fear. And as you branch some of those off, one of the emotions under fear is anxious. Anxious on that wheel is then broken down into overwhelmed and worried. So I always tell people, why do we have anxiety? And people are like, well, I don't really know. Or some people will say, well, it's because of survival. And I'll say, you're absolutely right. Anxiety started in the human DNA actually as a survival mechanism. So your fight, flight, and or freeze. So we get our little Samson out. And I tell people, if you're walking up a mountain and you see Samson, and Samson's a rattlesnake, the one I have in my office has a little rattler just to make it a little bit more real. If you see Samson the rattlesnake, or if you see a rattlesnake going up that mountain, I always tell my clients, what are you going to do? And the answer that I get the most is, well, I'm going to get out of there. And I say, are you going to be overwhelmed if you see him? And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, are you going to be worried if you see him? And they're like, absolutely. And I always ask, why? And they say, well, he's dangerous. And I say, why? They said, well, he's poisonous. And I said, okay, so if he's poisonous and he gets you, what happens? Well, if he bites me, there's a high probability that I die. And I say, okay, so we're talking about life and death here. And my clients go, yes. And I would say, I agree. If a rattlesnake gets a hold of you, depending on what part of the world you're in, there's a very high possibility that you actually do not survive that. It is a survival-based response. Nobody has to sit there and explain that to you if you come into contact with a rattlesnake. You just know that because your anxiety response is now on. It is a fear-based survival response. You're worried, you're overwhelmed, anxiety is high. We need to survive. So I always ask people, let's talk about the fight, flight, or freeze. If you come into contact with Samson, are you going to fight him? And my clients are like, absolutely not. And I'm like, why? Why not fight him? And they're like, yeah, he's going to win. And I was like, I agree. He is going to win. So we're not going to fight. Are you going to freeze? A lot of my clients say, yes, I will kind of freeze, kind of assess the situation around me, and then I'm going to get out of there. So then we're going to fight. So between fight, flight, and or freeze, we've got two of those mechanisms that are probably going to be pretty present. I don't know of anybody that would readily fight a rattlesnake unless, I mean, that's what you're up for and that's your thing. It's not my thing. I would be getting out of there. Anybody that knows me knows I'm deathly afraid of snakes in any capacity, which I don't even go hiking up the mountain for that reason. So it is a fear-based response. Life and or death is at stake. We are going to freeze and flight. We're going to get out of there. But if you look at the wheel, remember, like I said, it's fear and then it branches off into overwhelmed and worried. If you look at that wheel, the calm one from the calm app that I use in individual therapy, If you look at that wheel, overwhelmed is also in a completely other section. And remember, just like in the wheel in my last one, they're color coded. So on the calm wheel, fear is in purple, and overwhelmed is branched off from fear, anxious, overwhelmed. But overwhelmed is also in a completely different category, completely different color on that wheel. And I always tell people, I'm like, okay, so can you find overwhelmed anywhere else on this wheel? And once they find it, I say, what is it linked back to? And it's linked back to stress, because 99.9% of the time, and no, that's not literal, it's just a figure of speech, you are feeling stressed, not anxious. Now, some people get offended by this and say, well, Ashley said I didn't have anxiety. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when you feel quote unquote anxious, you need to recount what you're saying, because it's not anxiety. More times than not, you're not in danger. We're not walking around. I mean, at least in the part of the world that I live in, like I said, I'm in Utah. I'm in a pretty small community. I live in a pretty big county, but the community I am in is pretty small. I would say it's not a wealthy community. It's more of a middle-class community. So in the part of the world that I live in, most of us are not walking around with life or death at our feet. If you live in a community where maybe crime is higher or drug use is higher and there is a little bit more things going on, then you might live in a little bit more true emotion-based anxiety. However, in the part of the world I am in, most of us are not walking around with our life in danger every time we walk out of the door. Okay. I'm not greeted by Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, whatever other serial killer movie you want to use as I walk out my door. Typically not. I'm not typically greeted with rattlesnakes and other things. I'm not typically crippled by huge spiders that are going to come bite me and kill me. In this part of the world, we just don't have that. Okay. So when people say I'm anxious, I always tell people, let's really wheel that back. I'll ask people, what was the fear? And 9 times out of 10, it's something like, well, I had anxiety about going to school. And I'm like, okay, so let's look at that. Are you going to fight anybody at school? Well, no. Are you going to run away? Well, I want to, but I'm not going to. Are you going to freeze in the middle of the hallway? They're like, no. And I'm like, okay, so is anxiety the most appropriate thing? Because your life was not in danger at that point. Anxiety is probably not the most appropriate. You can go through the feelings wheel and find a lot more appropriate emotions than just I'm anxious. Okay. So the goal of this, number one, is to get you to see anxiety is a survival-based emotion. I am not talking about the disorder. However, if you want to go there, we can get into the disorder, because the very first criteria for generalized anxiety disorder is worrisome and or ruminative thoughts. Remember, if we branch that off, it goes fear, anxious, worry, overwhelmed. So you're feeling worried. You're not anxious. You can say, I'm feeling symptoms of anxiety disorder. That's different. I want to get people out of the habit of saying I'm anxious, when we can go through the feelings wheel and identify 12 other things besides anxious, because your life is not in danger. That is the goal. So really ask yourself, when you say you're anxious, is my life in danger? Is there a more appropriate emotion I can use? Is this a Samson-like situation? Is my life in danger? If not, anxiety is not the most appropriate emotion to use. Okay. So what's the big deal? Many of my clients ask me following this activity, what's the big deal if I tell myself I'm anxious if there's no survival-based fear? Okay. I say the brain is a very literal organ. So when we use terms that are not literal or do not make sense or do not match, the brain can get confused. So what happens is, if we tell ourselves we're anxious continually out the day, the brain will actually wait for that fear to happen, because you said anxiety. And remember, it was put in the DNA as a survival-based response. So if you say I'm so anxious, the brain's like, anxious, anxiety, okay, everybody, all brain cells on deck, and they wait. But it never comes, right? The fear never comes. So then when you repeatedly do this, by the end of the day, your brain is like, can't function anymore. It's like tweaking out. It is just all over the place. It's frazzled. It can't think because the brain experiences a mismatch between perceived danger and actual danger, leading to confusion and heightened sensitivity. Because you've said anxiety all day long, the brain is so literal that it's waiting for this survival-based fear to happen, and it never happens, so that the brain gets confused. So when you say anxiety, the brain constantly is like danger, 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 and there's no danger that comes. And I hate to tell you, when you say you're anxious about going to work or anxious about a presentation, that is not anxiety. That is not a survival-based fear. You're not anxious. Okay? You are feeling overwhelmed. You're feeling scared. You're feeling nervous. You're feeling worried. You're not anxious. Stop doing that. I would argue this is one of the biggest problems we have in society today with this quote unquote mental health crisis that we're having. This is a very easy way to start breaking away from that quote unquote crisis. You're not anxious. You are feeling symptoms of the disorder, but emotionally, anxiety is not the most appropriate thing to feel. Okay. Another part of generalized anxiety disorder is irritability. Okay. It's different to say, I'm feeling irritated. The brain goes, I get that. I feel irritated. I can do that. But when you say I'm anxious, the brain's like, and it waits. Where's the fear? The fear never comes. So when you say that over and over and over and over again, the brain does not understand perceived versus real danger. And then everything becomes dangerous. Everything becomes fearful. Everything becomes quote unquote anxiety. So it causes confusion and a very heightened sensitivity. And you can almost feel like you're going into fight, flight, and or freeze every single day, multiple times a day, because you told yourself something that's actually not. So this is a pretty short one compared to some of the other video that we had. But what we did, if we go back and review some of these slides, number one, we went over emotions, what they are, the feelings will, how to use it, find one that works for you. Okay. Then we went through appropriate emotions and anxiety using Samson the snake. So am I telling myself what I'm truly feeling? Is there a more appropriate emotion or emotions to be using? More times than likely, yes. Getting out of the habit of telling myself that I'm anxious, because if I look at the wheel, anxiety is probably not the most appropriate. And unless my life is in true life or death danger, anxiety is not appropriate. I need to find some other emotions to help my brain really process what's been happening. Okay. And then we ended with what's the big deal? The big deal is the brain will get confused. You have heightened sensitivity. You can feel like you're going into fight, flight, or freeze multiple times a day. We do not want that. Okay, in our next video, we're going to wrap up cognitive behavioral therapy for now with behaviors. So you have broken down the thoughts, you've broken down the emotions. Now we're going to break down the behaviors. That's going to be one of your final videos to cognitive behavioral therapy. It is going to come back full force when you start dismantling core belief systems, which we will get into later. But your emotions is going to kind of be that last piece to tying in the videos with cognitive behavioral therapy. So I hope you've enjoyed this. As always, questions, comments, concerns, email me at utlcsw@gmail.com. As always, if you need resources, worksheets, anything like that, I can give those to you totally free. I've got a lot of resources, websites that I can send you to for more information on this. And if there's anything you're like, I kind of want to bring this up to my therapist, but I don't really know how to word it, again, reach out to me, utlcsw@gmail.com. I will be happy to provide you with anything that you may need. Okay. See you guys.